Hi there, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We'll just wait a few moments while we get everyone joining us through from the waiting room. I think we're probably about there now. So thanks for joining us. We're delighted you're able to spend the next hour or so with us. This afternoon is going to be an afternoon of, I suppose, experiments and firsts. So this is the first virtual field trip that Future of London will be conducting. And it's also the first time that we will, after the event, be inviting you to join us for a virtual networking session afterwards. So we really hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for kind of experimenting with us. We're really delighted to be trying a new format. Just a little bit of background. My name is Anna O'Deedon. I'm Head of Knowledge at Future of London. And for those of you who are not familiar with what we get up to at Future in London, we are an independent network, and we support those people who work in planning, housing, regen and infrastructure. And we work both across the public and the private sectors. Each year we put on a research programme, and in 2020, with the support of our fantastic sponsors, that's Arup, Landsec, Montague Evans and Pollard Thomas Edwards, we're bringing together a series of events that look at how public and private sectors can work together to achieve the net zero ambition. Now, overall, our programme is going to be considering how the transition to a net zero future will impact nearly all aspects of life. So that's from the fuel we use, through to the behaviours that we need to change in order to achieve net zero, and of course, how we're going to pay for it all. But today we're not going to be focusing on any of those elements specifically. Instead, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the design and planning of homes and neighbourhoods within the context of net zero. We think this is a really critical topic to explore. Around 40% of UK emissions come from buildings, and research suggests that zero carbon homes, they've got a real potential to help us meet our ambitious climate targets. But what does a net zero home look like, and what are the specific challenges associated with building net zero homes in London at scale? Well, typically, Future of London would have organised a physical field trip, and we would have invited you all to join us in a real place somewhere in London, and we would have taken a tour and discuss best practice and what we can learn from that. Of course, that's not possible, and so that's why today we're trying it in a virtual sense with our video visit. So a little bit on how that's going to work. Excuse me. Now, ahead of the event today, you will have had the opportunity to watch the video tour of the site in question. That's the New Garden Quarter, and that's where we're going to be starting our discussions today. We've chosen the New Garden Quarter in the London Borough of Newham because there's loads of great practice here, from sustainable drainage that incorporates rain gardens through to blue and green roofs. It works really well as a sustainable site. But we've also chosen New Garden Quarter because we think it illustrates some of the broader debates, challenges and questions associated with achieving our 100% net zero housing at scale in London. So as a scheme, we think it asks us to reflect on what more we've got to do as designers, as planners, as developers, as local boroughs, in order to work together to achieve that net zero ambition. So to reflect on those questions and to suggest a way forwards, we are going to be joined shortly by Tom and Justin from Pollard Thomas Edwards, the architects behind the scheme. And once Tom and Justin have had their conversation, we'll hand over to Victoria from LLDC to share her view. And then we're going to invite you, the audience, to join us for an open debate and Q&A session where we can figure out how we might work better together in order to achieve those net zero ambitions. And then finally, we've got our networking at the end. So just a few housekeeping points. In the chat function, we just posted a link to the interactive map that you will have already had an opportunity to see, but we thought you might find this a useful resource through this afternoon's session to refer to as the architects are discussing the site in question. The other point is, please turn off your video and audio for now while we're talking to Tom, Justin and Victoria. And then when we get to the Q&A session, we'll be inviting you to turn on your audio and your visual then. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tom and Justin.
Thanks, Anna. That was a lovely introduction. Welcome everybody to this lovely summer day as we take you through our site here. So everybody would have seen the video, and Justin and I will discuss some of the key concepts behind the scheme in the next 20 minutes, and then we'll have Victoria and then QA afterwards. So my role at PTE is Head of Sustainability. So I work across all our projects. So I wasn't directly involved on this project, but one of my key roles is to carry out post-occupancy evaluation on our projects as part of our research and development. So I review our own projects and also review other people's projects as part of various schemes we've got at the moment, but particularly Building for 2050, which is a large BEIS research project on low carbon housing. So at PTE, we say, and we really do try and do POE on all our projects. There's various barriers to do post-occupancy evaluation, but I think we've managing to do at least a very light version on all our projects across several thousand homes a year in London. A key part of that is really working out what you want to find out, what you want to learn, and obviously a key part of that is its energy performance. But really, it needs to be combined with the social side as well. What do the residents think? What do the main stakeholders think? So at PT, we've combined it with our comms team, just really helped share the workload. So our research team and comms team work very well together. We've got an excellent comms team who send out resident questionnaires, organise site visits, more formal site observations where we take notes and report back on each other's projects, stakeholder reviews, and then hopefully work with partners as well. That's a key part of POE, is to work with your the client, the landowner, and then bring in universities, academics, and that third party to help you objectively assess your projects. So today, this is part of that POE for this project. We will be carrying out a more formal structured review, but this is the kind of opening session to help share some of our findings and start discussing this project in a more objective way. So thank you very much for Future of London for arranging this event and enabling us to share this POE process with yourselves. So zero carbon. I think just to provide a bit of context, if you cast your minds back to 2006, we in the UK, we had the World Cup that year. We had David Beckham scoring wonder goals against Portugal, and I think it was the quarterfinals. We had Take That in the charts. We had a promising Labour government, and the economy was riding high. No one had heard of the subprime loans crisis or anything about that. There was a bright future ahead. Then we had the future Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, give us a very exciting speech. And I remember at the time, it was one of the most ambitious housing policies in decades. And he said in 2006, he said, every new home will be a zero carbon home in 2016. So that was the target in 2006. We had a 10-year run up. We had the Zero Carbon Hub was set up, and I did quite a lot of work for them on their performance gap project and wrote some guides, the Builder's Book and Services Guide, all about how to improve the energy performance of our homes. And they came up with a definition. We came up with a definition. It started off of being exactly what you think, zero carbon, net, across everything. So unregulated and regulated energy. And then it was slowly watered down. It was, I think, 2011, it was redefined as just regulated, just building regulations energy. And then it was not everything on site. You could have these allowable solutions. And then by 2015, the whole policy was scrapped. The Conservative government scrapped it and said it was too difficult, too onerous for developers. So what came out of that was some really good lessons. There was a performance gap review by the Zero Carbon Hub. There was Innovate UK funding to look across hundreds of new built homes with new technology to assess how they were performing. So it's really good learning that came out of that whole process. And the GLA picked up on that learning and said, for London, we want to continue with the zero carbon standard. And we're going to pick 2016 to still deliver that zero carbon standard. And the definition they used was the slightly watered down version, which was essentially operational energy only. It was so not embodied carbon, just operational, and it was just regulated energy. So not you know, your PlayStations, your TVs, your unregulated. It was just regulated, and it was even more watered down. That was you only need to get 35% reduction on site. So a significant amount on site, but then you could pay for the rest in these offsets, carbon offsets, which are still in use today. So it took a while for that offset to come in, that process coming, because it's quite a complex procedure through Section 106. This project, Chobham, came in being designed around 2010. It came in as that definition was getting defined, and it meets the first rung on the ladder. It meets the 35% improvement over building regulations, 2013, and then because it was got planning before the 2016 date, it didn't have to pay the carbon offsets. So that's a bit about the background of the zero carbon standard in London. We now have what's called net zero carbon. So that's where we are today. Certainly looking forward to 2025 and beyond. Net zero carbon encompasses everything. So it's embodied carbon, operational carbon, whole life carbon over the whole life cycle of the project. So typically this is a 60-year period, and it requires life cycle assessment to show your whole life carbon figure. So it still allows for some sort of carbon offsetting. So it still allows for a payment, but essentially the onus is on reducing carbon as much as possible on site and trying to hit all of your carbon reduction on site. And we have some targets now. So we have a 2020 version of the London Plan that includes, it's a slight upgrade on the 35%. It's now you have to have 10% by fabric, 35% overall, and then it's a higher amount of carbon tax. So we're now at £95 a tonne of the carbon tax. And the biggest change now is that we're now using carbon emission factors that accurately reflect the grid. So essentially this means that electricity is a lot more efficient than gas, which means new schemes coming forward now aren't doing gas, CHP or gas boilers. They're nearly all looking at electric solutions, either heat pumps or not. So that's the biggest change now. As we go forward to net zero, we'll have to look at more embodied carbon. We'll have to look at more improved performance on that. I don't want to say too much about net zero now, but that's the definition. It's the whole life. It's very challenging from what everybody's saying and initial calculations. So it's very challenging to do on site, but it still does allow an offset either for a payment or an offset mechanism off-site. So I think we're gonna start talking about how this applies to Chobham. Because I didn't work on this project myself, I'm gonna bring in Justin Laskin at PTE. He was the project lead on this project, and he's gonna tell us a bit more about Chobham itself. So Justin, we've cleared up that it's not zero carbon. So what is it? What is the energy strategy?
Well, firstly, just to say, Tom, thank you very much for that. It's a really useful and thorough sort of understanding of the background to it. In short, the energy strategy here is to reduce carbon emissions by 35% beyond building regulations at the time. And as you've already hinted at, it's quite an old project at this point. It's part of a larger master plan that we designed back in 2011. So all in, that's more than 1,000 homes across the 4 zones being delivered here. And I think it highlights one of the really key challenges of large complex projects like this is that they take a really long time to deliver. You know, we're 9 years in on this and we're only 2 zones out of 4 finished. And in that kind of time, policies inevitably move on. Technology moves on. And one of the challenges that we're really always trying to balance is how we're still achieving best practice and still achieving a sustainable design when projects will be, you know, taking sometimes decades to make a reality. So we started this zone, Zone 4, which is now called New Garden Quarter, back in 2014. And as you hinted, we were working to the 2011 London Plan. So that meant there was only planning obligation to achieve 35% reduction, and there was no obligation for carbon offset payments at that time. And the energy strategy follows the GLA energy hierarchy that we'll all be familiar with, the be lean, be clean, be green approach. So firstly, we achieve it through good fabric efficiencies. In the case of Chobham Farm, we're at U values that vary between 0.13 and 0.16. And I mean, obviously we're doing a lot higher fabric efficiency on the projects that we're delivering now, but I think it's important to keep in mind that at the time, back in sort of 2013-14, this was really good practice levels of U values at that point. And then the next point, the Be Clean, we achieve our energy via on-site gas-fired combined heat and power, a plant that we're delivering on-site on the southeast corner of the site. And that gives electricity and hot water to the entire development. Now, obviously, I think we all know that that approach has fallen slightly out of favor with the GLA in recent years, but it's, again, at that time was considered to be one of the most effective methods for supplying particularly large projects like this with energy for that time. And then the final point is that we top that up with the green. So our renewable technology here is photovoltaics. Most of the roofs across the entire project are covered in PV. And so that's how we hit the 3 levels of the energy hierarchy to achieve our 35%.
Great. That's really clear. One thing, I had a question about the heat network. So you decided to build, or the client, Telford's, decided to build their own CHP for this zone, which is a very common approach now. But they did have a local district heat network. I'm just wondering why you didn't connect into that.
Yeah, it's a good question. We definitely did consider it because there's a number of networks nearby. And in fact, the connecting into the existing Coafley network, which is actually just across the train tracks adjacent to Westfield here, was our preferred approach right up until just before we submitted planning. I know the client spent a lot of time negotiating with their engineers and our engineers in a room trying to hash out the specifics of this. But, and I'm not an engineer, so I may get some of this wrong, but the way it was explained to me is there are some inherent inefficiencies built into the system that they have at the moment. So again, not knowing all the numbers and being able to spout that back to you, the way it was explained to me, and it stuck from the engineer, the metric that they showed in their energy strategy is that plugging into their system would raise the carbon emissions so much so that it would treble the amount of PV that we were going to need to install on our roofs in order to reach the same level of carbon reduction. And that was actually way more area than we even had available on our roof. So it just simply wasn't an option for us. There was one other point which was more anecdotal, but as I understand it, there were some very sincere concerns about the cost efficiencies for residents of plugging into that particular system. Anecdotally, they had heard that some of the rates that were being charged to residents that were plugged into it were significantly higher than what they felt they could offer with a more efficient system delivered on site. And so I think those 2 factors were the key points that made them decide that they wanted to be in charge of their own energy network and deliver their own system.
That's very clear. Thank you. Yeah, and I think I know from other projects it's quite often a logistical reason as well, and possibly legal reason for ensuring that you get the energy online at the right time. And to reduce kind of negotiations between the district network and development. Okay, so just moving on to talk about a bit more about Chobham. You know, carbon emissions, getting to net zero is obviously a key part of it's one key metric of environmental impact. And what about the wider aspects of sustainability on this project?
Well, I hope everybody who's listening now also had the opportunity to see the film that we did for the walk around, because I do touch on a lot of these points in that film, and I don't want to bang on too much repeating the same old points. But I do think that it's that broader sense of sustainability where New Garden Quarter really shines, actually. I mean, firstly, obviously, it's a brownfield site. It was a coach park back in the time of the Olympics, and it had sat derelict for 4 or 5 years at that point. So taking a site that's basically a sea of tarmac and turning it into a lovely new garden square and delivering high density housing there is a sustainable approach, particularly when you're as well connected to transport links and to local amenities as we are, because we're only a few minutes walk away from Stratford Station, Stratford International Station, Stratford High Street, etc. It's a very walkable location. And then the point that actually Anna and yourself have already alluded to is I think it has a really excellent SUDS strategy. So it deals with rainwater sustainably, which I think we're sort of all doing now as best practice. But I think it also deals with it quite beautifully. Our landscape architect, Churchman Thornhill Finch, has designed it in such an integrated way that for me, it feels like it's just sort of a natural part of the landscape. It puts it on display and uses it to sort of add quality to those spaces without making it feel like it's sort of forced. So we've got rain gardens and blue roofs and retention ponds and swales, all of these things that we're all doing, but done in a really sort of effortless seeming way. And then obviously the local ecology has been really significantly enhanced here, going from a sea of tarmac to all of these new mature trees and native species that have been introduced. And I think that gets a lot of credit goes to LLDC for this, because everything in the landscape was conditioned as part of the planning application. I mean, everything down to the literal trunk diameters of every single species and type. And so that really captures the level of quality and makes sure that you're going to deliver on all of the things that you say you're going to deliver on when you're designing it back, sort of 5 years previous to that. And then there's a whole host of other more technical things that, again, are now sort of common practice, but mechanical ventilation with heat recovery for the flats, energy efficient lighting and appliances, low flow water taps, all of those things really contribute to making what we think is quite a sustainable place for people to live.
Great. And, you've obviously got some really happy residents there. And what are the sorts of things that people are saying to you, and what, in terms of successes, do you think is a real highlight for yourself?
Well, I mean, again, anyone who's watched the film will have seen a couple of residents talking about living there. For me, I do think that the best metric of the success of a place is how much people like being there and living there. For me, the homes are probably the biggest success. And we've obviously, I mean, you've already mentioned that we do try to do post-occupancy evaluations on all of our projects to some level. We haven't done a formal POE on this one yet, though I think that is in the plans, but we have had the opportunity to speak to an awful lot of residents, and we've had overwhelmingly positive feedback from them. It's not really most of the... Sorry,
families as well. I think the thing that struck me when I was walking around site a few weeks ago was the amount of families out and about with access to really good amenity as well. It's not something you necessarily have on the standard London high-rise or high-density project.
It's unusual to deliver that much family accommodation at this level of density. And I think we always try and deliver some sort of aspect of doorstep play for the amount of homes that are family homes you are expecting to have children. What we've done here in terms of trying to make a really clear sort of protected delineation between the public and private realm has meant that residents do really feel that they can sort of just open their doors up and let their kids run out and play. And that's a great thing to be able to offer to people in such a sort of high density development and in central London. And it's been really popular with them. I mean, the only other points that we keep hearing over and over again is people really love the space standards. They're big flats, they're generous with big rooms. They have really high ceilings as a standard, and people love that. And they love the windows. People love their views and their big floor to ceiling windows with the views out into that garden. And so we just keep hearing those same comments over and over again from residents living there.
Great. So you've got some happy residents. I agree. That is the kind of #1 aim of any project like this. But what about improvements on either this project or the next project? How would you look to improve?
There's obvious ways that we could improve this. I don't think I've ever done a project where I said, oh, that was perfect, we don't need to change a thing. There's some obvious ones here. I mean, firstly is in the title of what we're speaking about today. I think we could really reduce the carbon further here. I mean, ideally, I'd like to see this be 100% carbon reduction and deliver that on site, but I know that that comes with some challenges. I think if we were doing it again today, we would certainly have better fabric performance than we do. I mean, it's not bad at sort of 0.13 to 0.16, but I'd want to see 0.13 as a sort of minimum throughout, and actually better, as we're doing on some other projects at the moment.
You've got some triple glazing, haven't you? You've got triple glazing.
We do have triple glazing. It's not everywhere, but obviously we've got some, as you will have seen in the film, a lot of really challenging infrastructure boundaries. And so facing onto the busy roads and onto the trains, we have triple glazing along all of those boundaries. I think we could do better in terms of air permeability, and that would be a really good starting point. And then finally is the energy source. I think, as you've sort of already hinted at, a combined heat and power plant probably wouldn't be our preferred approach today. I think a more sort of communal air source heat pump solution would be more likely where we'd be heading with that. And we'd be looking to do something like that if we were going to do it again today. I mean, you obviously are far more expert than I am in terms of trying to get those carbon reductions down to zero and what that might mean. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we would do different today, both in terms of if we were trying to achieve the new London plan, the sort of 2020 definition of zero carbon, as well as what it would mean to achieve net zero?
Sure. Yeah, I think the current definition, or the new London plan, what it's called, the emerging London plan 2020.
Intend to publish.
Intend to publish, yeah. I think that would be quite straightforward to improve this scheme. You wouldn't have to do any significant redesign. You'd be looking for a slightly better fabric, so good triple glazed windows throughout. I think the key thing is that we're using a different SAP now, so it has different carbon emission factors. So as you said, we'd be using probably a communal heat pump system, and possibly on an ambient loop, which is a low temperature loop, which means it's very efficient and also helps reduce overheating in the flats. And then the final part of the new London plan is this be seen element. So I think, you know, we'd have to commit to some sort of post-occupancy evaluation, ideally with a third party and a university or a consultant who's going to provide some objective analysis, and ideally with energy monitored data as well, you know, in use data after 2-3 years of use. I think we're going to see a lot more of that coming forward. As I said, it's now a requirement under the current London plan, this 2020 plan. So that's quite straightforward. I think the real challenge is to deliver net zero, and that would require a pretty radical redesign, not necessarily of the concept or, you know, the planning stage design, but definitely in terms of the specification at construction. So, you know, on this project, and remember, you've got to look at embodied carbon and operational. So let's just deal with those in turn. Embodied carbon, construction stage carbon. On this project, it's going to be a challenge. It's concrete frame. You could possibly look at timber, if it, you know, mass timber, CLT, if it's in line with the fire regulations. If you can't do that for high-rise reasons, then you're looking at basically increasing the amount of recycled content and reducing the material as much as possible. And if you can, possibly not possible on this site, but reuse any material that is on the site, so it doesn't go to waste. So that idea of being really lean with your design, both in the structures, is key. I think the first thing I'd say is that we should calculate what the embodied carbon is. And this is becoming more common on our current projects. We've got a very good plugin for Revit that gives us all the volumes of the materials out. And then we can just work out what is the embodied carbon of the structure, the cladding materials, all the rest. And you can start to see the big ticket items, such as the structure and the foundations of concrete. And you can say, okay, can we put in some more recycled content into that concrete? Some GGBS, you know, you get it 30–40% recycled content. Steel is commonly 100% recycled anyway, but you might want to check that on your supplier. You know, rebar is always 100%, but other steel is sometimes a mix. Aluminium windows, 50% recycled. Timber windows, obviously good. So there's composite windows are generally pretty good. And then the finishes, you can do a lot with the carbon emissions from the finishes. So carpets, you can specify 98% recycled content. Floor finishes, or even vinyl can be recycled now. So there's a lot you can do in terms of that embodied carbon, even on a scheme like this. And then the operational, I think we've said, you know, put a heat pump in there, electric, it's going to make a 50% reduction if you put a heat pump in there. More PV, possibly, if you can get it. And I think the real challenge for this job is that it's an apartment of 6+ stories. And that basically means the roof area per unit is getting very small. So therefore the PVs per unit, the solar panels per flat, become at a maximum of possibly 1 panel per flat. So it doesn't start to stack up, which is why it's very difficult to get to net zero. So I think the combination of that, you could get to maybe 80% for this project. So it'd be, you know, approaching passive house ideally, because you've got great certification measures there and you ensure that it actually delivers. That would get maybe 10% improvement, then a heat pump that gets you up to 60–70%, and then possibly more PVs, and then batteries or some sort of storage would help you increase that and help you use the electricity.
But it sounds like even with all of the measures that you've just described, you still may struggle to get 100% zero carbon on a site of this kind of density, which I hadn't really realized that this level of density is actually more challenging to achieve that on than the sort of lower density, traditional sort of suburban or, you know, less urban type of projects.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I think, you know, houses are easier because of the amount of roof area you have. So you can put 16 PV panels on it and you'll be a net exporter. And then when you're a net exporter, you can pay off the embodied carbon and you can become net zero that way. So houses, it's a lot easier. And there's lots of case studies. I can mention the Building for 2050 website has got 4 excellent case studies there. You know, University of East Anglia, the Enterprise Centre is very low carbon, possibly the best performing building in the UK. And then Lark Rise is a Passive House Plus project by Beer Architects. So this idea of Passive House being the benchmark, then heat pump, then renewables, is really key to get over. And then if you can't get to 100% then or more, then you need to think about offsetting, either through a payment or by offsite renewables somewhere else.
So I've got more questions here, but I see that Anna's joined us, so I have a feeling that means I shouldn't ask them.
I'm afraid that
possibly open these to the rest of the audience. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Now, how to get net zero on high density living is a real challenge. Maybe PVs on the horizontal elevations, that would help reduce. But I guess another question is, should we be aiming for net zero on these sorts of projects where it's quite clearly very difficult to achieve? Should we just say, do as good as you can, but should buildings really be power stations? Possibly they should just be homes, homes, and deal with their primary function. And then we green the grid and do as well as we can nationally to have net zero on a wider picture.
Okay, well, I get that's a really good question to leave us on. And before we perhaps circle back and include the audience in that discussion, we'll jump over now to Victoria. Victoria is joining us from LLDC, and she'll be talking us through her perspective on net zero housing and the context of London and how we might look forward to the future and achieve net zero more broadly. So over to you, Victoria.
Great, thank you, Anna, and also thank you, Justin and Tom, for that discussion, and I suppose, posing me some questions as well. I suppose for some of us, it's always interesting to hear from others, and I think some of this is a very big topic at the moment in response to sort of COVID and our green recovery, and how this all sort of fits into that broader agenda. So I'm just going to spend a couple, sort of 10 minutes or so giving a bit of an overview of what LLDC has been doing. You'll see there is some similarity in what Tom's been talking about and kind of where we came from as a standpoint, and also the duration within which we've been trying to achieve some of this. You can debate, or we can debate for hours probably, how far we've got on some of that journey and where we kind of sit in the spectrum. So as Anna said, my name's Victoria Thorns. I'm a Community and Sustainability Manager at the London Legacy Development Corporation. And before I sort of go into our zero carbon approach, I'm just going to give you a quick overview, I suppose, of our remit and the focus area we work in. Sophie, are you switching on the... Great, thank you. So LLDC, or the London Legacy Development Corporation, was created back in 2012. We are a functional body to the Mayor of London, and we were specifically set up to deliver on the Mayor's promises, or the promises that were made when we won the Games, and back in 2005, so 15 years ago now. We are part of the Mayor's family, which also includes the likes of TfL, the Met Police, London Fire Brigade, etc. So we are primarily a regeneration agency. That's what we've been set up to deliver. But we also have a number of different roles. So we own land. We own what is known as the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and also some land in Hackney Wick and down at Three Mills. So we develop those sites, but we also manage the park. We host and work with events providers to put on events, and we also run and operate the venues on the park. And as Tom and Justin mentioned, we're also the planning authority for the area which New Garden Quarter or Chobham Farm sits within. So we, as well as being part of the GLA family and being a mayoral body, we have a requirement, as I suppose other organisations in London do, but to kind of contribute to the delivery of the mayoral policies and objectives. So one of the key things so that we get asked around and have to report on is how we, leading by an example and being seen to demonstrate, whether it's London plan requirements, the environment strategy, the Mayor's transport strategy, and all of those kind of policies. Next slide, Sophie. So tying all of that together, I suppose, is our overarching mission, and that is that we will use the opportunities from hosting the Games to create opportunities for local people and drive innovation and growth. And I think this is where the opportunities is quite an interesting point, because it's both around jobs and skills and training, but it's also around providing new homes, high quality homes, and access to what all of that brings. And a key point for us at the moment is this bit around innovation and inclusive growth and good growth, as the Mayor likes to refer to it. But also, how can we drive some of the innovation? How do we work with the industries to really champion things? When we hosted the games, from a sustainability and construction perspective, it championed quite a bit. So there was a big focus on being the greenest games and looking at the venues and the carbon, the sort of sustainability of those buildings, and really sort of putting in and trying to make some big early infrastructure things, which I'll come on to. And as Tom and Justin sort of mentioned, we have a big district heating with its pros and cons that go with this. What we also had at that time leading up to the game, so this is 2010, 2011, and even earlier, floating around with all of the kind of zero carbon objectives, was an increased scrutiny on what was our ambitions going to be and what were our areas of focus. And in some ways, at that point in time, how were we going to respond to this seeming governmental drive to delivering zero carbon and the zero carbon policies. Next slide, please. So in particular, for LLDC, we developed our sustainability strategy back in 2011, 2012. We already had the games time infrastructure delivered us a district heating network, which serves the buildings on the park. So at that point in time, it was providing heating and cooling just to the venues, and also to Westfield. So Justin touched on the district heating system, which is by New Garden Quarter. So there's an energy centre there, and then there is a second one on the park over at what's called King's Yard, and they have the ability to supply all of that. At the time when that concession was entered into, so back in sort of 2010, it was a 40-year concession with Cofley or NG, and it was seen that it would be able to take on the demand for these new houses coming in, and it is also was set up to burn gas and biomass. Things have now, of course, changed. We've got a grid that is decarbonised a lot more than we thought, and there comes all sorts of complexities within all of that, which is probably a whole other session. We also learned quite a bit from what could be done building structures wise. We have some venues, if you take the Velo, that managed to improve sort of its performance by re-looking at how the roof is done, the timber that's used and those materials. The Aquatics also managed, which is quite a concrete heavy structure, managed to increase its percentage of recycled concrete within that structure and things like that. As Tom alluded to, it was also a time when we had the Zero Carbon Hub floating around, we had Code for Sustainable Homes and all of those kind of objectives. So we were, and I suppose this is reflective of where we've got to as a strategy, is at that point in time when we were fixing our strategy and with the Zero Carbon Hub, the policies that were coming out of that, at this point in time, we'd got to that kind of watered down position that Tom talked about, with regulated emissions being what was going to be focused on. So we kind of took the view that we would, as an organisation, work to that position of being zero carbon and complying and delivering against effectively the grey bit of that triangle. So that compliance element, which is around looking at your renewable energy and then looking at the fabric efficiency standards. So that's what we're working to in particular, and then our policy, as well as touching on carbon, materials, infrastructure, sort of transport, sustainable lifestyles, water, biodiversity, etc. In particular, on a carbon perspective, we said all our new buildings, because we basically are mainly doing new builds, would be zero carbon. And I think the difference for us is that we set ourselves a target that we would look to achieve a 65% reduction in emissions against the 2010 building regs, because that was what was being used at that point in time when we set it. We'd look to do renewables on site, and then we would allow an offset of, say, that remaining 35%, but that offsite had to be locally, and we since subsequently our planning authority arm of us we have produced an SPD around carbon offset with price per tonne of carbon at £60 that gets paid in, and then local schemes. So we are talking the likes of schools with retrofit programs could effectively bid for that process. They had to demonstrate their carbon savings and things around additionality and things like that. We also, recognising that actually our approach at this is very focused on those regulated emissions, so thinking about effectively what you can control in a building. People live in these buildings that are still going to be producing emissions. We set ourselves a target that we'd have a 15% reduction in emissions, so what we referred to as actual in-use energy. And this would be delivered through an engagement programme with the occupants, as well as energy efficient appliances and all of those measures that we can put in. Because one of the things we were we still recognise and kind of recognised back in the day when we were setting all of this is people live in these buildings and they will live in them different ways and understand things differently. And actually, if someone wants to leave the lights on in their very sustainable home, they're going to. So how do we kind of communicate some of that and work with them on the understanding of what it means? We also, not under carbon, but under our materials targets and requirements, did set ourselves an embodied carbon target. So we said that we would reduce our embodied carbon by 15% in new construction and try to do it to a compared sort of industry baseline. And we've had some success on this, and I'll touch on that a bit later. And these requirements, although they were corporate in our sustainability policy, at the time that we were doing all of this, we were also putting in our legacy community scheme planning application. So this is the application that covered the 5 new neighbourhoods on the park that is part of the legacy scheme, and they became planning requirements. So in terms of what we've done, just conscious of time, is Chobham Manor, which was our first neighbourhood, achieved zero. So we did a similar approach to what New Garden Quarter have done, sort of that zero carbon, and then we have actually done 25 homes that we went to zero carbon on. We now have recently commissioned a POE study to actually assess what is the performance, have we really achieved that, or was it, or is it very much a kind of design, what's the reality? Eastwick and Sweetwater on phase 1, we've had great success in looking at an innovative approach to our structure and trying to make it more lightweight and modular construction, which has achieved a 22.4% reduction in embodied carbon. So in terms of kind of where we are now, we've got a big focus on this whole move to, well, reality of net zero. What do we need to do and how do we kind of achieve that? And one of the focuses we've been taking recently is to look with and work with the likes of the Letty network, look at REBA 2030 and consider those much more kind of absolute targets, and how do we bring in whole life carbon assessments, that embodied operational. I think one of the things that I find quite interesting at the moment, and perhaps it's a conversation as part of the Q&A, is the differing wording and how people refer to different things, and actually being very clear, what do we mean and what are we tackling in that perspective? Because different groups refer to sort of embodied carbon and operational carbon. You've then got the UK GBC refer to construction and operational. And as a sector and an industry, there is, I think, a need for us to be really clear on what do we mean and what are we talking about and where do things kind of sit and what are those targets. And I think a big thing for me is we also need to remember, and Tom and Justin's discussion kind of picked this up, is there's more to sustainability than just carbon and energy. There's all the other things that go with it, and how do they interplay to make a sustainable place, and to consider what that is. But I think it's also that all of these places have people living in them, and actually they all have differing needs. So how do we understand what those are, but also not lose the fact that really what we should be building and creating is great places that are well designed, that people want to live in, want to spend time in, especially when we're now spending loads more time at home. And how do we think about, I suppose, zero carbon and our climate emergency at that much bigger scale sometimes, rather than not always necessarily needing to focus in on the very individual scale of a building. So yeah, I will leave it there. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of our activity and a bit of background. We're starting to do a lot more work around circular economy and embodied carbon and things like that. But yeah, happy to kind of respond during the questions.
Thanks, Victoria. That was brilliant. And thank you, Tom and Justin, as well, for your contribution. So I think we've had an awful lot of suggested questions peppered throughout both of those introductions to the project. We can come back to those, but I also wanted to open up the questions to the audience now. So how we'll do this, we will ask everyone to turn on their video now. And if you've got a question that you'd like to ask, then we will invite you to use your digital hand in order to kind of let us know that you are keen to share a question. So let me just kind of give you a little bit of a tech run through on how that might happen. And while I'm doing that, you can perhaps have a think about what your top questions might be. Here we go. In order to ask a question, you'll see that you've got a kind of a bottom ribbon on your screen, and within that you have a little participants tab. If you click on participants, then a pop-up that looks something like the thing on screen will arrive. And if you click on raise hand, then you'll be indicating to us that you've got a question to ask. I'll say your name in turn and then invite you to turn on your audio and ask your question to the panel. So I hope that's clear. I'll stop sharing my screen now so we can all see each other. So yeah, any questions, please do raise your digital hand. While we're waiting for some of those questions to come through, I'll just kind of pose one to the panel. So we discussed earlier that sustainability is of course net zero, but it is something more than that as well. It's about sustainable neighbourhoods, and I think that the Olympic Park and of course New Garden Quarter does a really good job of tying things in, like being close to a transport hub, being close to a brilliant new park. So Victoria, Tom and Justin, how do you think that we can encourage, I suppose, sustainable neighbourhood thinking and net zero neighbourhood thinking as opposed to just net zero housing development thinking?
I think from our perspective, and then it'd be interesting to hear from Tom and Justin, it's about thinking in it at a bigger level. So it's what is the sustainability strategy for the neighbourhood, and the idea of, there's loads of the different diagrams, but kind of that wheel of the different themes of what makes up a sustainable place, and bringing in the various different elements. And one of the things we've been doing on our projects is that, you know, the initial, those inception meetings, the kind of, whether it's called sustainability or workshop, but those kickoff meetings and being really clear, what is the kind of the overarching principles, objectives, and what are we trying to achieve from this neighbourhood, and where do things kind of sit, and how does it kind of come together, rather than seeing it as this additional work stream that sits on its own. It needs to be embedded in that whole and very much be part of that project vision and those overarching objectives. And that's definitely, I think, where we've been trying to come from as a client side, is it's integral. You can't take it out, it's how it works together, but there are elements of it that are slightly more techie than other elements.
Great, thanks. Well, I'll throw that question over to Tom and or Justin.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. That is the carbon emissions challenge, isn't it? It's a global issue. And so we do need to think of it as a much larger scale, not just nationally, zero carbon Britain 2050, but the whole world. However, having said that, that's not an excuse to not do the best you can on each individual project. And I think it needs strong leadership from clients and landowners to set that process from the start, set it into the brief, All the projects to date that have been approaching the net zero have had either public sector landowners or a really strong client who's really pushing this issue. And then the consultants, designers have responded to that. But if you don't have that strong leadership, it won't happen. But I just add to that this idea of global carbon emissions on a building scale. I think it's really important to stress the added value of some of these measures that we're talking about. So it's not just about carbon. So for example, you know, if you go to the Passive House standard, which is the premium fabric standard across the world, it's been well proven and tested. If you delivered something to the Passive House standard, that's very much aligned with benefits, other benefits for the community, for the residents. So it's got very good indoor air quality, for example. So it's a healthy home. It filters out pathogens. It filters out pollution if you have certain filters. It's very good acoustically. So noise is a key health concern of everybody really living in all sorts of housing in London. It's even got kind of longevity benefits of it lasting longer because it's a more massive construction. So if you can tie these carbon targets and apply them so they've got wider benefits of health and well-being, or better ecology, better biodiversity, helps security and crime, for example, then you're on a win-win scenario. So even if you've got some stakeholder or whoever it is doesn't want to go beyond the minimum carbon emissions, you can argue it from the wider social benefit and the wider environment benefit.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to throw the questions open. We've had Alexia has suggested a question. So Alexia, if you'd like to turn your microphone on and ask your question, that would be great. And then after that, we'll go to Susan May. So Susan, just get ready. But Alexia, over to you first.
Thank you. And just thanks to the presenters, because that was super interesting. Always good to see it kind of in practice and understand the difficulties in delivering these schemes. And I guess my question actually circles around the fact that, so you mentioned the complexities of making the connection to an existing heat network. And I wondered what your take was on the latest GLA guidance, which essentially is pushing us down that route. And that slight contradiction with potential net zero targets, because as you say, a lot of the times when you do connect to an existing heat network, your carbon output is a lot higher due to the inefficiencies of that existing network. So how do you see that contradiction potentially, and how do you think we can overcome it?
Wow, that's a really good question. It is a perceived contradiction, isn't it? On the one hand, we're saying that gas should be more accurately accounted for, which is what the SAP emission factors are doing. So essentially having a more accurate electricity carbon emission factor is helping electric over gas. And on the other hand, you've got the perceived benefits and sometimes real benefits of having a communal system, the scale of benefits of scale. I think it's just it's a design question. I think it should be more flexible in policy. I think it should be put to the engineers on each project to assess which is better. Now, if you've got a development like the Olympic Park of thousands of homes plus, then it does make sense to have a district network. And then you can change the front engine. You can change that from gas to cleaner fuel down the line. So I think we're going to have both going forward to be a zero carbon Britain in 2050, and it's going to have to be project by project basis.
Yeah, I would only add to that. I mean, I've done an awful lot of projects with various types of combined heat power plants. I've still not done one that tied into a district heating network yet, not for lack of trying it on nearly every project that I've ever done of this sort of scale and complexity. So there are evidently incredible challenges to making it work. But you're right, Alexia, we are being encouraged to go down this route. I think Tom's point is a really interesting one about trying to address some of the front engine bits that are possibly driving some of those inefficiencies, because it takes so long for these things to be up and running for the number of homes that make it efficient, that by that time, in some cases, you've already got built-in inefficiency. And so having some flexibility or modularity to it, or finding a way to update the technology as you go to make it a more efficient system might make it easier to swallow. And then the logistic and legal hurdles of trying to get the timings to align, we all know how difficult that can be to make work. I don't have an answer on how we overcome that particular bureaucratic hurdle, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'll just add from our side. So the park is in, policy-wise, it's in a district heating network area. So the definite presumption is we connect, and we've also got sort of planning requirements and things, but I have consultants and engineers saying, but it's not helping my carbon, and I could do this, this and this, and we'd be in a much better position. And then we're sort of sat there being, but we need to do this from policy and we need to do this from this. So a lot of our attention actually at the moment, more senior, is actually trying to work with the district heating provider to say, okay, how are we going to tackle this challenge? Because there are homes that connect in, there's new developments coming forward that can connect into that network. So there's a ready supply of housing, and therefore how can we connect into it? The other thing large scale district heating providers also don't overly like is us being more fabric efficient, because then we reduce our heating demand. And they've got a business case that's for however long, in the case of us, it was for 40 years, based on fabric efficiency back in 2010. And now we're building much more efficient properties with less heating. So it then causes them more problems. So it's a really complicated agenda. It's hard for us, and we're struggling with it. And it's sort of at a very senior level trying to work through with various consultants. And I think the reality, as Tom, it's sort of that project by project basis, and trying to be really clear on what can be delivered, when and how, and what's the best route to go down. The other thing I would add is district heating is also interesting from a resident's perspective. I don't know what the experience is like at New Garden Quarter, but we've had challenges with residents, what that handover process is when they move into their property, it being explained to them what they need to do, what their bills then look like. They are very often can be different to what comes through in a normal property. On the park, you can't change who you get your heat from, so you can go off to the market and find someone else. So there's all of that kind of educational side that also goes with it, with residents, which has been an interesting learning definitely for us, is working on the park and how we manage and work through some of that. So yeah, it's not an easy one.
That's great, thank you. Alexia, I forgot to ask, which organisation are you from?
Sorry, I'm from Landsec, so I work in sustainable design for Landsec.
Great, thank you. So over to Susan, please introduce yourself and your organisation and your question to the panellists.
Hello everyone, yes, Susan May, I'm Head of Housing Design at Urban Design London. So first of all, just to say thank you so much for the session, and it's really interesting seeing, the practicalities of viewing a scheme virtually. So I'm kind of really excited to see that, and I think you've done a great job in the interactive page in the video, and obviously having the presentations on the back of that to kind of go through the points today. So that's great. The question that I had was hopefully not too rambly, is really around the ventilation side and the sort of aspect side of things. Because we know that when we are pushed into higher densities, we invariably end up with aspects that, i.e. single aspect homes, and aware of, with a passive house, literally house type, you generally have ventilation front and back or on triple sides, etc. With a flatted development, and particularly if you've got single aspect, you're so much more dependent on mechanical ventilation to make it work. And mechanical ventilation has certainly in the housing association sector, had lots of challenges in terms of how it's maintained, how it's used by occupants, is it sufficient, is it designed for purge, and all kinds of things like that. So it'd be really interesting to see how that whole area has been dealt with. And obviously this site is probably a good test case in that I can understand it's very challenging. You've got busy roads, you've got railways, potential pollution, etc. So yeah, that whole kind of area, if you can kind of spill the beans on how that's all worked and how you think it is going to work sustainably going forward.
I'll start off on this one, and then Tom, perhaps you can chip in as well. You're absolutely right. That is always one of the biggest challenges, is trying to get the mix of dual aspects right, and how you sort of balance the various constraints. I mean, from an efficiency point of view, in terms of cost, you want as many flats as you can get per core, per floor. But from a qualitative point of view, you want to try and really minimize that, so you're in direct opposition with each other. What we've done here at Chobham Farm is what we call a mansion block approach, or a compact core. I'm sure most people will will have heard those terms before. What it effectively means is we're trying to minimize the number of flats accessed per core per floor so that you can maximize the amount of dual aspect, but not have to rely on a sort of deck access type approach, which is another way of getting 100% dual aspect, but does come with other challenges in terms of privacy and quality as you're accessing all of those homes. So generally at Chobham Farm or at New Garden Quarter, we're between 4 and 6 flats per core. And you'll be getting, from memory, we're about, I want to say it's 70% dual aspect. There's an awful lot of cores, which are not particularly efficient in terms of your net to gross numbers for your developer client when they're calculating that out. But it does mean that you have the opportunity to get as many homes with dual aspect as you can without having to resort to the sort of deck access approach. The common parts are kept very much to a minimum. And what we did here is, because this project was being designed right as we were finding all of these overheating problems happening, particularly in communal areas that were tying into a combined heat and power plant that have basically got hot water just pumping through the corridors all the time, 24/7, and causing it to overheat. So all of the stair cores here have direct access to outside so that you can open a window and sort of purge ventilate them in that way. We really wanted to ensure that as many homes as we could get dual aspect, but in particular the family homes, which here there's 45% of them across all tenures are 3-bed or larger. All of those are dual aspect, so that we never have a family home that's got, say, a single aspect only onto a railway or only onto Leighton Road, which would be a pretty challenging aspect. So I don't know if that's answered all of your question, Tom. You might be able to chip in as well.
Just quickly, I'm very conscious of time, guys. So and I don't want to keep anyone longer than promised. So Tom, I don't know if you've got a very quick response, or perhaps we can jump to the next.
Very quickly. I think once you've done what Justin said, maximising dual aspect, it's really a technical challenge. And you'll know, Susan, I'm sure everybody else, about the unintended consequences of poor indoor air quality around airtight, underventilated homes. So really it's about providing purge ventilation as much as possible, openable windows that can be open and people want to open them, and then an MVHR system that works. So commission it, specify it so it actually works, and double check that with third party.
Thanks.
Great. And Juliet, I think you had a question. So if you can unmute yourself and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Yes, hi, thank you. Yeah, Juliet Butler, I'm a project director at Swan Housing. Thank you for the presentation.
You're a little quiet, Juliet. Can we ask you to speak up?
Sorry, it's probably because of that. Hi, I'm Juliet from Swan. Sorry, put that out of the way for earlier. Thank you for the presentation, and the video I thought worked really well, so also happy to see that, so it means we can continue to do these sorts of things virtually. I know you touched on some of the challenges on large scale regen projects that take years to deliver, so we feel that too, and also as a long-term asset holder, one of the things I was just wondering was, as we see that shift more from CHP schemes to them air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, in this country we don't seem to have the dense projects that have got those in operation at the moment. It seems to be more sort of in Europe and other places, and we need to kind of hear from those schemes how that really works. I just wondered if perhaps you have seen any schemes in this country where that's in operation, and we've got the data to say that it is working well, and it's good costs for the residents in situ as well. That was the area where I was looking at, and it may not be that you do know that, but it might be something Future of London can touch on at some point.
I can jump in there. So as part of the Building for 2050 project, we're reviewing a scheme that's possibly only about a mile away from this, where we are now in London Quarter. It's with Galliard Homes. It's on Church Road in Leighton.
Yeah.
And that's probably the first time at scale in London where they've done a communal air source heat pump, low temperature system. That is what we're talking about here. They've got efficiencies of 55%, so improvement of 55% just by using that heat pump system. It's by Glen Dimplex, and they've also installed one as a test case about 5 years ago with Lend-Lease in Elephant Park. So they did a trial there. So they've got some data. Glen Dimplex have got data of that project, and now they're monitoring the project in Leighton with Galliard Homes. So we'll be publishing that data on the Building for 2050 website. So far, it looks like it's fairly standard, really. It looks like it's a like-for-like swap, CHP for heat pump. You still have a heat interface type arrangement.
Fantastic, thank you.
Victoria, have you got a response to that, or Justin?
No, I was just going to say Tom's example actually is the one I know that sort of we've been keeping an eye on, because it is sort of, it's down the road from us. So yeah,
that's the only one that I've heard of as well, but I can say there's getting ready to be a whole heck of a lot more of them out there.
yeah.
That's good news. That's very good news.
I must admit, the one thing I do know is that we need the jobs and the skills in that sector, because it is a new, so it opens up a whole new door around training and jobs and things like that. So,
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Look, everyone, I'm very conscious of time, and I said we'd do an optional networking event, but there are some interesting questions in the chat.
Really
so I wonder, given we're a small group anyway, if we perhaps ask our panelists to take a quick look at the group chat. You'll see in there's a few questions. So there's one from Lorraine, one from Matt, one from Gordon, and earlier on in the chat there's a few others. So if you perhaps pick a question that you think might be a good one for you to respond to, and then we can hear from the broader group, even if we're not doing audio with everyone.
So I think Lorraine's question was directed at my comment on, who's doing net zero now, or at least trying to. And it has obviously been led by public sector or third sector. Yes, you're right, institutional landlords, lots of universities, Cambridge colleges, Oxford colleges, people like that, large estates. The London estates are pushing this as well. They are certainly interested in pushing this agenda, and that's probably the large-scale net zero projects that we're doing now are all in that category. They're university clients or large London estate clients who are prepared to spend that money and that time to get this right. I think it's, as a private developer, it's very hard to argue that you go beyond minimums. So that's where the state legislation needs to come in and legislate for higher standards.
Yeah, I'd just add on that it also depends on the kind of the pressures that different developers or organisations have. And I know we know some of the ones we work with or are aware of is actually it's their investors and shareholders that are starting to ask the questions. Yep. And the idea of kind of green risk and climate and some of the changes that the banks are making around climate change and climate risk and things like that. So actually some of those pressures as well as policy are also helping some to see, especially when a shareholder is saying, what are you doing on this? Starts to make them ask some of those questions.
There's a question here from Matt, which is about retrofit, and could there be anything that we could do to Chobham Farm Zone 4 to make it carbon zero now? I think we could get it closer. My guess, and Tom, maybe disagree if you want to, I think it would be very challenging to get it to carbon zero, true carbon zero, without relying heavily on offset payments. So, I mean, we could definitely improve the CHP to a system that's more efficient than the gas-fired one that we've got in place. We could, I doubt you could retrofit a great deal to improve the fabric at this point without doing something quite intensive to get all those bricks off and improve insulation at this point. And there's not a great deal more room to introduce more measures like PV or anything on the roof because we've already used it all, unless you're going horizontal with it, and that would have quite an aesthetic impact at this late stage to try and incorporate it. So I'd be interested to hear what you think, Tom, if there is any other opportunities.
No, I think you're right. The heat pump, swapping the heat pump and get the gas CHP out would be a clear win, possibly a 50% carbon saving there. You could possibly improve the fact that your U values, your wall roofs are already at best practice anyway, and there's no real value in going beyond that. The glazing is already good. The air tightness you can improve. So Susan's point, you'd have to really make sure the ventilation is working, then make the construction draft proof, so airtight construction, not an airtight box, not this fallacy of an airtight box. It has to be draft proof construction with a suitable ventilation system, which is.
And is that able to be retrofitted? Is that something you could do after the fact? Yeah,
you can. Yeah, it's a bit more expensive. It's a lot easier getting it done on a new build, but certainly making things airtight, the construction airtight is is a huge part of energy loss. In certain buildings, it's up to 40% of energy loss through ventilation losses and infiltration losses. So if you can get the air tightness down to below 1 and hit NFIT or Passive House standards, that would be it. And then make sure the MVHR is working with opening windows as well. Then you'd be in the best zone. Max out the PV, put some PVs on the horizontal shading. We're starting to look at that now, but I would question the sense in putting so much PV across the country on buildings. I'd in many ways prefer to see local sites of PV in sites where it's not good for housing. The maintenance of PVs is considerable, not too bad, but it's considerable. 5-10 years down the line, change the inverter. After 20 years, they've got to 80% efficiency. So after 20 years, you've got to replace them probably. So yeah, it's a great question. Really, no is, apart from those things, no, because I think it's at a good stage already. Retrofit of Victorian, Georgian, 1960s, government is talking about retrofitting stuff we built in 2000, pre-2000. So that is where you need to add insulation. Ventilation is absolutely critical. You need to ventilate. So providing active ventilation systems is really critical.
Great, thank you. Are there any other final questions from anyone who's joined us for the Q&A bit? Please do either kind of drop us in the chat or raise your hand.
I'll answer Gordon's question very quickly about blue roofs. So a blue roof is essentially a green roof, but it's got water attenuation. So it's got typically 60 mil to 100 mil of crate, and it just retains that water on the roof, and it slows down the surface water runoff. Very nearly, it's always got a green roof above it, so some sort of sedum. And has it
an incredibly counterintuitive thing to do as an architect. Typically, we want the water away from our building as quickly as we can get it, so it doesn't leak. But here, you decide to hold on to it and let it very gradually seep out into the landscape so that you don't overrun it.
That's it. Surface water runoff, Gordon. It's not really zero carbon, but I guess surface water runoff is really about pollution into the sewers and therefore overloading our sewers.
And just on Lorraine's question about the selling point of sort of energy efficiency net zero, so definitely we found it problem. Anecdotally, it was a positive. The ones that we've our sort of target exemplar homes that were going for the kind of benchmark zero carbon and lower water sold very quickly and were very popular. It's going to be really interesting as part of the POE process, because we're doing interviews with residents to kind of delve into this a little bit deeper in terms of what do they appreciate, what are the kind of those value points. We know we've had questions, especially around waste. Newham their recycling policy, because it's recycled by the borough, is different to some of the others. They don't do food waste, and we've had complaints around that. So it's, apologies, my house phone is going. But yeah, so I think it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the POE that is actual hard concrete fact rather than just our anecdotal conversations with people.
Great, thanks. Are there any other kind of final questions or comments or points for debate? I guess we're a small enough group now that we can kind of open it up to the floor. If you've just got anything to say, then please do turn off your microphone and kind of shout it out. We'd welcome any additional questions. I'm sure that everyone's conscious of time, as I am, so we'll begin to wrap up then. So thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. Like I say, real first for Future of London in terms of our video visit and our attempt at recreating our field trips from pre-COVID life. So thank you very much for joining us and kind of playing along with our experiment. We didn't get time to do our experiment in networking, but hopefully you'll join us for an event next time where we can try that out. Now we know you're a friendly bunch. Perhaps it won't be so scary. In terms of what's coming up next for our programme, we have some more video visits, so we'll definitely keep you updated about that. And then in October, we have our digital conference week where we will be hosting a number of webinars, and we would love you all to come to that. So please do stay in touch with us and keep updated. In terms of next steps. If you have any questions for the panel that you'd like us to follow up with, or any other kind of comments, then please do reach out to us on Twitter, or you have Sophie's email address as well. And so with that, I will just say thank you very much again, and we hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.